welcome to the third edition of Consult 101. And today we'll be discussing unconventional cases with Pranav and Nithish. So, Pranav is an incoming associate at Bain, and Nithish is an incoming associate BCG as well. So, we'll hand it to them to give a more detailed intro about themselves and what they've done in INSTI over the last 5 or so years.
Sure. Hey everyone, I'm Pranav Condur. I graduate with a BTech in Aerospace Engineering and a master's degree in Energy Systems from IITM this year. I'm heading to Bain as an associate consultant later this year. Happy to do an unconventional case today. In my time on campus, I spent it with the quiz club, did some aerospace research, some CFI, and a lot of bit talking.
Okay. Hi guys, I'm Nithish. I'm the class of 2023 recent graduate. Will be going out with BTech in biotechnology and MTech in energy systems. I will be joining BCG later this year as a associate. During my time in INSTI, I was in a bunch of things: Shastra, Sarang, 180 DC, etc., etc.
All right, we can start the case.
Before we start the case, let's just do a small overview of what unconventional cases are, right? As you guys some of you might already know, unconventional cases is something which doesn't have a fixed framework like profitability or market entry. It's basically what the interviewer just comes up on the flow or doesn't stick to your conventional frameworks, right? But the thing that a lot of people mistake is just because it doesn't have a framework, that doesn't mean it also doesn't need to have a structure. Like how you get through this is being structured at every step of the way. So few pointers to just start with: you narrow down to the scope of the problem. If you think the problem is just too broad, or you can't structure it, or you can't make it meaty, you start down by breaking it into smaller chunks of problems and start solving it, just like you'd solve with any other case. For example, in profitability, you break it down as revenues and costs. In this case, you will break it down as chunk A, B, C, and then start solving that way. And yeah, so one example as to how you break down such a big problem into a smaller solvable bits is, let's just say an example might be, this is not the case I'm giving, this is just an example I'm citing. Like your friend is contesting in the institute elections, and he's coming to you and he wants you to be his consultant to make him win. How you start with this can be one of two ways. You can either take the mathematical approach of saying that, okay, fine, we need so and so votes to win. How do we go about getting the votes? How do we get about getting 50% of the votes, let's just say? Or you go about by timeline, like phase by phase of election, which is like phase one is where you declare yourself as a candidate, make the PR. Phase two is where you go on boots on the ground, etc. So these are two standard approaches where you can do every step of the way. Just make sure you're mutually exclusive, collectively exclusive, VC, etc. And then, yeah, once you get a hold of solving a lot of these structured cases before, like market entry profitability, this shouldn't be an issue. So yeah, Pranav, do you have anything to add?
Right. I think before we get into the actual case itself, any case that you're doing, irrespective of whether it is unconventional, profitability, market entry, or a guesstimate even, there are 4 different buckets that I think you should evaluate every case you do on. The first bucket being how messy you're being, how structured and logical you're being. The second one being quant, how well do you work with numbers? Are you able to make the right approximations, and are you able to do the calculations both accurately and quickly in your head? Number 3, communication and verbal. I think using the right words in the right situations, making sure you're able to effectively communicate to the interviewer what you have in your head and in your paper. I think that's very, very important. And number 4 is business context. Of course, you're not expected to know everything about every industry, but are you able to ask the right questions to extract what you need to know about the case context? But also, do you know things happening around you in the world in terms of general knowledge, in terms of what's happening on a business front, on a global front, all of that, right? All of that adds value. The first 2 are non-negotiables. You need to be really good at being easy, logical, structured, and quant. The other 2 obviously have to be there, but they're sort of a benefit. I think you get brownie points for being really good at them. So I think every case that you do, try to evaluate yourself on these 4 buckets. We'll obviously, once we do our cases, we'll go through feedback and see where it fits in all of these buckets and give you some more perspective on that front.
For our first case, this was actually asked to Pranav during his interview with Bain a couple of years ago during the internship season. So we'll be starting off with that. Pranav, whenever you're ready.
Yep, good to go.
So Pranav, from your resume, I see that you are into climate and sustainability a lot. Since you picked Apple as a company you wanna make an analysis on, I'll give you a case according to that. So
Sure.
assume that I'm the CEO of Apple, and
Okay.
I come to you to give us a good ESG policy.
Got it. Just to make sure I've understood everything right, you're Tim Cook, and I'm hired in to help sketch out Apple's ESG and sustainability policies and vision. Is that right?
Yeah, that's true.
Got it. I'd like to ask a couple of questions to understand the situation a little better.
Sure.
Now, I understand ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance, but I'd like to what specifically you mean by ESG or sustainability in this particular context.
Okay. So moving forward, we want to make sure that Apple has a lot of initiatives that are socially sustainable, such as net zero carbon, like all the trending things, right?
Sure.
Which help us project us as a really good company. So that is a thing we're looking at right now for this case.
Got it. Just to make sure we're on the same page here, we obviously want to be carbon positive, be at net zero at least. And on a social governance front, we want to make sure we're doing everything right according to a corporate social guideline. Is that right?
Yeah, pretty much.
Sure. Okay, makes sense. Now, I understand Apple has a whole host of products and services. I'm assuming we're looking at everything across the board.
Yeah, sure. Globally, we can look at it.
Understood. So geographically, we're looking at everything across the globe as well.
Yeah.
I'd like to understand if other CEOs in the Valley have set some sort of a trend, or you've been inspired by them in recent years, say a Google or a Facebook or something like that.
Like obviously, as a company as big as us or Google has a lot of ESG initiatives already in pipeline. For example, Google did a lot of COVID-based ESG initiatives a couple of years ago.
Right.
Facebook also started something called Communities for Disaster Management. So these are things they're doing. We also want to be at par, if not greater than them, in terms of the initiatives we do.
Understood. And a couple of questions to close this out. Do we have a time frame and a budget in mind?
Budget, you can assume ours to be a bigger budget. It's fine, like classic CSR budget. If needed, we can expand it on it. That shouldn't be of any concern for now. Time frame, we're looking at it in the long run, which is like 10 plus years.
Understood. Got it. So all of this is fairly helpful. I'd like to take a couple of minutes to process everything you've told me, and I'll get back to you with an approach on what we can do. Does that sound good?
Sure.
All right. So here's a quick approach as to how I like to analyze the situation. I think two broad segments here. The first is I like to look at everything Apple is currently doing internally to see if we can tighten the screws on an environmental front, on a social front, and on a governance front. And the next big segment is we'll explore new streams, new ideas, new big bets that Apple can look at taking to hitting its ESG vision in the next 10, 15 years. Does that sound good?
Yeah, that sounds good. You can start with what Apple does currently now.
Sure. Okay. So to analyze what we're currently doing, I'd like to spell out the entire value chain and look at initiatives across the board under each different part of the value chain where we can tighten our screws on and at becoming carbon positive, at improving conditions for our workers, and on that front.
Sure.
So I think to start out with, I'll look at R&D, then we'll move on to legal and regulatory, post which we'll look at raw materials, sourcing, all of that. And then we have inbound logistics, after which we go to our core process, right? Which is processing, manufacturing, packaging. That is where the magic is made. Post that, we have, I think, obviously sales and marketing, but also very importantly, post-sales service in terms of recycling products and trying to create like a total circular economy within our value chain itself. If that sounds comprehensive enough, I'd like to start recommending a couple of ideas under each different segment.
Yeah, sure, you can do that.
Got it. Before we get into ideas itself, I think it's important to come up with a rubric to judge the ideas because, of course, I can come up with a couple of different things off the top of my head, but how do we know if it is actually beneficial to Apple or to what we're trying to do, right? So a quick rubric that I have is let's look at our three main stakeholders. I think number one here is Apple as a company. Number two is people. And number three is the environment, the planet, and whatever else. And I think if an idea is good here, we'd like it to benefit at least two of the three. Does that sound like something you're on board with?
Okay, small suggestion though here. How about we look at shareholders as a primary and then environment as secondary? Okay, fine.
Got it.
Let's scrap primary, secondary. I want you to look at three stakeholders. One is shareholders. Another is the environment. The third is our employees and anybody working with Apple.
Got it. Makes sense. Let's do that. Sure. So give me 30 seconds. I'll just iron out some ideas based on the stakeholders that we've just lined down and I'll get back to you.
Great. Works.
Got it. And given that we're looking at the current processes, I'd like to also preface this with the fact that we're only going to be looking at superstructural changes, not fundamental changes to what we're doing. I think those fundamental changes will come under the new streams and new big bets that we can take. So I think starting off with R&D, number one, my idea here is that we move away from carbon-intensive semiconductors infrastructure to something that is slightly more sustainable. For example, the M1 chip that Apple's used for their MacBooks was fairly carbon intensive, but moving away from that into the M2 chip, which is a lot less carbon intensive, is something that I think we should continue. Number two, on legal and regulatory, I think a couple of ideas here. First is let's not lobby governments for taxation or other such or finding other such loopholes where we can take advantage of in a cynical corporate way. But also number two, not looking at trying to cut down forests as much or trying to over inundate exploited areas. I think that's very important to do on a legal and regulatory front. Number three, on the raw materials front, I think we should avoid over drilling certain areas that are number one, not structurally great or geographically great, but also number two, affect people who live in those areas. I think it's very important to make sure we respect habitat. Now moving forward, I think that is pre-processing, right? Now there's logistics. I think there's inbound logistics and outbound logistics that I'd like to talk about as one. Obviously, moving away from transport mechanisms that are very fuel intensive or use fossil fuels. I think moving away from that into, let's say, electric vehicles for transportation or moving away from big shipping containers to something else that's more sustainable is something we should look at. Again, I'd like to preface all of this by saying there is a cost benefit that goes into making sure all of this is not going to take up a lot, is not going to make a huge dent into our P&L statement because at the end of the day, our shareholders are our primary stakeholder, and we want to make sure we are performing our fiduciary duty and delivering them as much financial value as we can. Now, moving on to, I think, the core of our value chain, which is processing, manufacturing, and packaging. My primary recommendation here is we move away from materials that are not very sustainable, such as plastics and certain metals, and move into something that can be a lot more renewables, things that are not as harmful to the environment, right? This is something that I'm very prudent that we focus on. But my major recommendations are on the post-sales segment, which is in terms of recycling products. I think there are two things we can do on recycling products. The first one is refurbish and reuse, right? And the second one is breaking our products down for parts and trying to recycle that and put it back into our value chain. The first one, in terms of refurbish and reuse, we put it back into a very late part of our value chain so that we can send it back to our customer as a functioning unit. The second is we break it down for parts and try to put it back into an earlier stage of our value chain, say into our raw materials or into our processing or manufacturing part. right? A couple of other examples here would be trying to use the metals in our devices themselves for things like making the medals for the Olympics. I think the Tokyo Olympics used discarded phone material to make their medals. I think that's an idea there. Hopefully this is comprehensive enough. If you have some thoughts on any of these ideas, I'd be happy to discuss them.
No small piece I have for you. So I wanted to pick three of the top initiatives across the value chain. What do you think can be the most beneficial to, let's just say, just the environment?
Okay.
And can you do a risk analysis on them, like something basic?
Got it. So I think off the top of my head, if I were to weight the three biggest initiatives that will have an environmental impact, I think number one, moving in the R&D section, which I mentioned, where I mentioned we should move away from carbon intensive chips like the M1 chip to something more sustainable like the M2 chip. I think because that scales, right? Because we have a number of products where this will go into that scale. So I think that is going to be immensely beneficial. Number two, I think on the raw materials front, moving away from materials that are harmful to the environment when discarded, but also in terms of not over drilling certain areas or not over exploiting certain resources. I think that is very, very important. And again, number three, I think the refurbish and reuse and the idea of the circular economy here, where you can put back materials into our value chain, is something that I believe will be conducive to making sure we hit net zero and become carbon positive. I'd like to take I'll take a minute to perform a quick risk analysis here, and I'll get back to you with those insights.
Sure.
Right, I think I'd like to look at the risks under three big fronts. Number one is cost. Number two is quality of our products and services, or performance of our products and services. And number three is, I think, in terms of business timelines, right? Going deeper into each of them, I think number one, on cost, a lot of these initiatives are going to be financially intensive, like moving away from certain countries in terms of like, or certain areas where we want to drill, but we'd like not to drill for environmental reasons. Finding other regions might be expensive. The reason that a particular area might be overexploited is because it's cheap there, right? So I think that is one big factor to consider. Number two, in terms of performance and quality, I think moving away from tried and tested infrastructure, right? Like our chips, our M1 chip is fairly successful. If we move away from that into something that is slightly more environmentally friendly, but might not be as computationally intensive or performance intensive, that might hurt our brand as a whole and performance as a whole. I think products, I think that's very important. Number three, timelines, because a lot of these initiatives take time and they might cause bottlenecks in our value chain, which might upset our business cycles. That is something to consider as well.
Yep. Okay. Great. We don't need to look at risks anymore.
Okay.
Let's discuss about the new revenue streams which you mentioned in your superstructure.
Right. Okay. I think I just like to clarify here. I didn't mention new revenue streams. I was looking at new big bets that we can take.
New streams for ESG initiatives.
Got it. I'd like to divide these new ideas that I have under two fronts. I have 5 of them. And I'd like to divide them into short-term ideas that we can get implemented in the near future, or say over the next 3 to 5 years to set the ball rolling. And I'd like to look at certain long-term ideas over the next 10, 15 years that we can implement to make sure we hit our ESG targets. Right? Okay. I think under short term, I have 3 big ones. The first one is access to tech in rural areas. Given that we've spoken so much about the environmental front, I'd like to also focus on the social and governance part of ESG. So I think in rural areas where people don't have access to technology, Apple should be putting in resources and products and services on the ground to help uplift the poor in terms of providing laptops for education and trying to ape certain government schemes that you can find in South India and other parts of Southeast Asia. Number 2, I think green bonds as a way to finance a lot of the projects that happen at Apple is a very crafty way of not just thinking about how to do capital allocation, but also how to finance other parts of what we can set up, right? It's a self-sustaining business proposition that we can look to in the future as well. Number three, I think investing in offsets for air pollution and other such harmful outputs that we have as Apple, wherever our manufacturing plants are or wherever we operate intensively. I think that's very, very important.
No.
Moving on to long-term ideas, I think number one, moving away from certain countries that have troubled political or geopolitical climates, moving our manufacturing base away from, say, China to other friendlier, more business conducive countries like India or Southeast Asia might be helpful. Number two, I think investing in R&D is very essential because it is a very long-term process. And we don't want to compromise on the quality and performance of our products. So we want to make sure that we're putting the amount of capital and time that's required to make sure our products and services are of the same or at the quality that our customers expect of us and we expect of ourselves. Hopefully this was satisfactory.
Yeah, I think this works. Okay, I think we can conclude the case now since we've discussed a lot. Do you want to maybe synthesize?
Sure. Starting out Apple's ESG vision for the future, we did two broad things. The first being tightening the screws on all internal processes to make sure we're ESG compliant. Number two, coming up with new broad ideas to help propel Apple's ESG future. Among them, we've identified three broad ideas. The first one being moving away from troubled economies such as China to more business conducive friendly countries like India and Southeast Asia. Number two, investing in R&D to make sure our chips and our infrastructure is more environmentally compliant to help take us to net zero. And number three, on a social front, we want to make sure we are accessible to rural communities and making sure we are using our products and services to help educate the underprivileged. But keeping all this in mind, there are, I think, three stakeholders that we've identified and aligned on. The first one being Apple shareholders, number two being the environment, number three being our people and our workers. But there are also risks associated to all of our ideas. The first one being the cost, the second one being a change in performance or quality of our products, and number three being a change in business timelines because of all the changes that we're trying to make.
Yeah, okay. I think that works. We can close the case.
Great. Thank you so much. So I think coming down to feedback and a couple of things that I think I did right versus what I did wrong and what I can improve. Number one, right, I think in terms of being structured, this is very similar to a growth case in some sense. So if some of you have looked at growth frameworks where we are trying to establish a point of departure, which is where you are currently, and a point of arrival, which is where you want to get to. The way to do that is obviously looking at everything internally and trying to boost that. And the other segment here is obviously coming up with new, bigger ideas, right? Which is what I did with my current processes and new ideas split. And in current processes, I spelled out the entire value chain where I looked at ideas under each value chain. And I think when you come to an idea sort of case, it's important to come up with a way to judge your ideas, right? Because not all ideas will be good. And a way to do that is coming up with a quick rubric. In this case, I did something like identifying three big stakeholders. And I think that's something you should align with the interviewer on as much as you can. So I think that's one big front. On the new streams, the way I structured it is we looked at both short-term ideas and long-term ideas. But also within each bucket, I made sure to prioritize the recommendation that I want to talk about first. So it's important that when you have a list of things you want to talk about, you prioritize them in terms of how much impact or weight they carry. I think that's very, very important. And I think going back to preliminary questions, it's very important to ask the right kind of questions to start off because I didn't get a lot of details in my case statement, right? I was just told ESG vision or ESG policy. So I think it's important to ask about and align with the interviewer on what exactly ESG means in this particular context, what they have in mind, but also in terms of budget, geography, timelines in mind. The company itself, obviously, I think a lot of people use the 3C1P framework, which is very, very good. But I think it's important to keep in mind that P doesn't just stand for products, but it's products and services because that will trip you over in certain cases. I'd like to, I think, shine light on one more thing, which is in terms of vocabulary and communication. Instead of just asking, "Hey, do you know what our competitors are doing?" I said something like, uh, "Hey, are other CEOs in the valley also thinking of these initiatives?" Right? I think by day one, a lot of people will have very similar case solving skills. What will maybe set you apart is what language you're using and how you're able to communicate what you have on your paper to the interviewer. So I think make sure the language that you're using throughout the case is tailored to what exactly the problem statement is. I think Nithish, if you have other feedback, that'd be great.
Yeah. So, right. Okay. See, one thing I felt was preliminary is very key in questions like these when as Condur said. It can be very random if you don't ask the right preliminary questions, and if the interviewer has something else in mind and you're doing something else, it's completely pointless. And the first thing we did was segment into current and new streams, which is pretty messy. And the next thing we did was got into R&D, regulatory issues, processing and packaging, etc. One thing I felt was what you guys could do, like Condor did, is think one step ahead, because they might immediately ask, "What do you mean by R&D?" And then you can't be clueless there. So it's always great when you're doing structures like this to think one step ahead of why are you bucketing instead of just randomly bucketing into messy. Think about why you're doing that. And next we came to the discussion about risks. In risks, people usually follow something called a PESTEL structure, which stands for political, economical, social, technological, environmental, and legal. These 6 risks, you don't need to put all 6 risks in there, but it's really good to keep the structure in the back of your mind just so that you don't miss anything, right? Even though in cases like unconventional, where we say that there is no framework as such, it's important to have like little frameworks like 3CP or PESTEL in the back of your mind, so that you can not miss anything. And after that, this is one thing we talked about was the new streams, short term and long term. And in the prelims, we already clarified that we are only looking at long term. So it's you can safely eliminate short term then. Like, I don't want to interrupt that, but yeah. And then synthesis went okay. So in synthesis, you should be very concise on what you want to say. This is where a very good notes, if you take like really good notes in between your case, that's where this comes in. Like, you can just circle bits of your notes which you want in the synthesis and start talking from there. Otherwise, you might need more time writing the synthesis down on the paper then saying it, which is ideally not recommended, because you're need to come up with a synthesis in less than 10 seconds of when you take 10-15, right? So yeah, that's it from my side.
Good. Thanks for your feedback, Nitish.